Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the ISCIA Seminar series, What Were We Thinking? This is our 11th seminar after we've just had our short break. And today I'm delighted to say that we are joined by Ragnar Van der Merwe, who is a senior postdoc fellow from the University of Johannesburg. Ragnar's research interests include, amongst others, the philosophy of science, the philosophy of truth, of pragmatism, and he also has an interest in complexity science as well. I'm very interested to hear the topic of today's talk, where Ragnar's going to talk to us about what he calls doomsday thinking. And I believe he will discuss and call into question the common sense sentiment that we face one or more existential crises. And that leads to a form of doomsday thinking and apocalyptic thinking too. So without further ado, I'll pass over to you, Ragnar, and then after your talk is finished, obviously we'll have time for discussion, and we'll open the floor for comments. So, okay, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much. Let me get my slides sorted out.
Okey-dokey. Perfect.
Okay, so as stated in the abstract, it's often assumed, especially I've noticed in moral philosophy or any kind of ethically orientated writing, that it's often assumed that without argument that we are facing one or more existential crises. And I want to just challenge whether that's maybe exaggerating things a bit. So here's an example from the 1960s and 1970s during the height of the Cold War, when doomsday thinking was rife. I can remember as a child this constant sort of sense that the world could end any moment. Well, combined with an evangelical Christian upbringing that was a recipe for fear. Here's American physicist Herman Kahn. He says, in 1960, I have a firm belief that unless we have more serious and sober thought on various aspects of the strategic problem, that being the nuclear problem, we're not going to reach the year 2000, and maybe not even the year 1965 without a cataclysm. Joseph Weizenbaum, addressing some students at Harvard University in 1976, says, I'm completely certain there's not the slightest doubt in my mind that by the year 2000, you will all be dead. And there's many more examples one can find. In philosophy, here's an example from French philosopher Jean-Pierre Dupuy, in his book, How to Think About Catastrophe. In fact, these are the first sentences of his book. He says, during the last century, humanity acquired the ability to destroy itself, either directly through nuclear war or indirectly by altering the conditions necessary for its survival. The breach of this fateful threshold had been a long time in the making, but now what had seemed only a remote danger was made acute and plain for all to see. Today, the recurrent crises involving the environment resemble those more or less serious elements that are apt to seem more disturbing than they really are, to the extent that they remind us of our mortality. Nature transcended itself in bringing forth the human race, but it took an enormous risk in doing so. As if to hedge against this risk, it endowed humans with a spiritual faculty, the spark of practical wisdom known as ethics. Only by making good use of this faculty can humanity hope to curb its power over things and over itself, a power that is excessive and beyond all destructive. Industrial society, which depends on the continuing advance of science and technology, seems now to have discovered with what agitation and confusion that exceeding serious threats weigh on its future. Okay, so this is typical sort of You find this in many philosophy books, many philosophy papers will lead with this kind of sentiment. What's important to notice here is the link between ethics and a prediction about the destruction of humanity. So this theme is going to run throughout my talk, that ethics and doomsday thinking about destruction of humanity, a global calamity, existential ruin, apocalypse, Armageddon, all these various phrases, it's closely tied to ethics, as we'll see. Okay, so some provisos before I kind of get into the talk proper. This is obviously limited time to discuss some very complex topics here. I'm going to talk about climate change, nuclear power, artificial intelligence. So obviously I can't do these big topics justice in just a 30-minute talk. So just something to keep in mind. I'm also not an expert on climate change, nuclear power, AI. I have done quite a bit of reading on the topics I'll discuss today over the years, but it's just important to note that I'm not a technical expert on any of these issues. I'm not necessarily familiar with fine-grained theoretical nuance or the latest empirical findings. Also important to note that any discussion about the future has a speculative component. So the talk's essentially about the future. And this will come up again, this speculativeness involved in predicting what's to come. It's important to note that I'm not saying that everything is always going to be wonderful. So I'm not saying that there's no chance that climate change will be a problem. I'm not saying that there are no risks. I'm not saying that we shouldn't plan for possible calamities. I am saying that we should avoid blindly following doomsday trends. So without question, just making claims about humanity facing existential crises. This involves avoiding making unsupported doomsday claims. We should avoid making bold, assertive predictions about the future, especially far into the future, or predictions that involve many if claims. I'll return to this later, but what we often see with these kinds of doomsday scenarios is an argument that goes something like, well, if this happens, and if this happens, and if this happens, and if this happens, and if this happens, ooh, we're going to be facing the most devastating. So there's all these conditional claims that need to be accepted before you actually get to the possible reality of whatever doomsday scenario. And we should avoid exaggerating the risks involved in whatever our favorite apocalyptic image is. But in just my essential motif here is to urge us to reconsider and tone down how we use terms like existential crisis, global catastrophic risk, apocalyptic event. I'm not denying that these things are possibilities, but just that we need to tone things down a bit. So I'm just calling for a bit of sort of sensibility and calm. So what is an apocalypse? So the same applies to phrases like doomsday thinking, to doomsday or existential crisis and so on. But I'll generally use the term apocalypse as a sort of a catch-all phrase for these different other phrases. There seems to be an ambiguity in that people use this term in different ways. There are degrees of severity when it comes to a catastrophe or a crisis, from total world annihilation on the one extreme to local catastrophes that might usher in a new paradigm. So it's going to be, as we see, as I go through the talk, I'll return to this at the end, but we need to be a little bit clear about what we mean by existential crisis, what we mean by an apocalypse. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, apocalyptic literature is a literary genre that foretells supernaturally inspired cataclysmic events that will transpire at the end of the world. A product of the Judeo-Christian tradition, apocalyptic literature is characteristically pseudonymous. It takes narrative form, employs esoteric language, expresses a pessimistic view of the present, and treats the final events as imminent. I'm mostly going to discuss sort of secular versions of this. I'm not going to go into Christian or Judeo-Christian or religious in general apocalyptic thinking too much. I assume that most of the people listening to this talk are more concerned about things like climate change and nuclear power than there are about Jesus' second coming. So I'll generally put aside the Judeo-Christian tradition, but perhaps the secular versions now are kind of a product of that way of thinking. The Center for Apocalyptic and Post-Apocalyptic Studies at Heidelberg University, on their webpage, it says, the myth of the end of the world is a real success story. Even in the Bible, gloomy images of the imminent doomsday can be found. The revelation of John, better known as the Apocalypse of John, prophesies the extinction of all life. Current end-time scenarios, for example, in the wake of climate change or the COVID-19 crisis, demonstrate the timelines of such imaginaries up to this very day. Imaginaries. Okay. Humanity without a future is a motif that has been handed down across epochs and cultures. Apocalypses are therefore not only one of the most fundamental ideas in the history of humankind, but also a recurring and empirically grounded experience of human history. So we see this, I mean, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but we can all think of historical cases of apocalyptic thinking. People predicting the end of the world is going to come at some certain date, or it's coming soon, and yet this has never happened. Arguably, there's never been an apocalypse, unless you mean by apocalypse something very mild. But we'll get back to that topic. So just a bit of an outline for the rest of the talk. Apocalyptic thinking is common in both academic and public discourse. I notice it mostly in moral philosophy when it comes to the academic domain. I'll get to the reasons why I think this is the case. We see it a lot in religious doctrines, of course. Many preachers preach an apocalyptic scenario, and we need to repent in order to be saved. I'm not going to go into that. And we see it a lot in public discourse, especially around climate change, nuclear power, and now AI, not to mention colonizing Mars to avoid the event. So those who are talking about colonizing Mars, like Elon Musk and his acolytes, it's often that something called the event will lead to the colonization of Mars. The event being some cataclysmic, apocalyptic situation, whatever that might be. It's just called the event. What these have in common is that they contain at least two key features. A focus on the future, i.e., it is by nature predictive and therefore speculative. And there's a fundamentally normative, specifically ethical component. In other words, everyone must do X to avoid the impending doom. So these are two features of apocalyptic thinking. A prediction about the future, often very speculative, and a normative ethical component that everyone must do something in order to avoid this impending calamity. So that characterizes doomsday thinking. And so I'm going to explore two questions. Is this kind of talk warranted? And if not, then why does it occur? Okay, so I'm going to explore those two questions in turn. And I'll quickly go through climate change, nuclear, and AI. So it's important to distinguish with climate change between climate catastrophe, which would be a global extinction event, and climate disruption and upheaval, which we seem to be seeing at the moment already. Sociologists Davidson and Kemp have the following to say. Many now argue that we should think about the previously unthinkable risks of climate change, including societal collapses and human extinction. Calamitous images of the future are not pathological or counterproductive. It is both necessary and valuable to imagine the worst-case scenarios of climate change. Critics of climate catastrophe often group together all visions of disastrous futures under labels like doomism or pessimism. This is unhelpful, and greater nuance is required. We need to distinguish between climate doomists who see catastrophe as imminent and unavoidable, and climate risk realists who see catastrophe as one potential future that should be avoided. Effective catastrophic envisioning requires that scholars, activists, and writers alike need to stress that a catastrophic future is uncertain, not inevitable, and reflect on their own social position. We should aim to be climate risk realists, aware of the uncertain and malleable nature of the future, not climate doomists who see catastrophe as imminent and inevitable. So we can consider the possibilities of catastrophe, but I think it's ambitious and exaggerating to talk about a certainty that there's this, we're hurtling towards a a cliff at breakneck speed blindly. It's one of many possible outcomes, and it should be taken seriously, definitely, but it's not inevitable. And there's a lot of talk about the reason for climate change being human greed, commercialism, or capitalism. As far as I can tell, it has a lot more to do with the exploding human population, although some saying that they're slowing down. But it also has to do with poor people just wanting to have the kind of stuff that most of us listening, participating in this talk are enjoying. It's not necessarily about greed and pointing fingers at ExxonMobil or Monsanto or whoever. Stephen Pinker says in 1962, Botswana and Burundi were equally destitute with an annual per capita income of $70, and neither emitted much CO2. By 2010, Botswanans earned $7,650 a year, 30 times as much as the still poor Burundians, and they emitted 89 times as much CO2. So just getting poor people to a level where they are enjoying a middle-class lifestyle, involving things like refrigeration, internet connection, laptop, things that we would almost consider basic rights. I mean, should anyone be not denied those things? Just doing that, just bringing the poor up to some sort of middle-class level will have a massive impact, is having a massive impact on climate change. It's not necessarily that we can point fingers at the greedy and pat ourselves on the back because we recycle our rubbish. I mean, many climate change protesters and leaders in the anti-climate, in the movement are flying from conference to conference in aeroplanes and living. It's sort of a hypocrisy that seems to be involved. Also, as far as I can tell, as far as I can tell, there isn't going to be one giant climate change event that will wipe out the whole of humanity. That seems almost like biblical talk. It's more likely that global disasters will increase. And according to me, it seems that these local disasters will gradually counteract climate change, thereby nullifying any doomsday scenario. So let's say there's local disasters that wipe out whole cities that are close to sea level. Those cities being wiped out is obviously not a good thing, but it will slow climate change. And so it seems like as climate change occurs relatively slowly, and as there's more and more disasters, that will counteract, it'll slow down the emissions. And also, once people start really feeling the impact, it's not just, well, it rained more, it's the hottest day on record, but once there's genuine kind of disasters on a local level, people will start to wake up. As far as I can tell, there's no climate change type scenario which is genuinely would invoke an extinction event of the sort that one often hears alluded to in the discourse and in writings. So nuclear destruction. So there's two ways this could happen: by nuclear power, some sort of accident at a nuclear plant, or nuclear weapons. So let me quickly talk about nuclear power. Renewables currently account for under 2% of global energy. Scaling up is unrealistic. As far as I can tell, it's just simply not going to, there's not going to be a future with renewables solely providing the power that humanity needs. Renewables are unpredictable and battery technology is way behind. So if you're going to say that renewables can do the job, you're betting on some breakthrough happening in the future that there isn't necessarily a sign of, or you're asking for everyone to go and sort of live in the forest and pick berries and so on, which is, again, unrealistic. As far as I can tell, nuclear power is the only viable option, despite certain risks, right? But 60 years of nuclear power have seen 31 deaths and 7,000 early deaths from cancer. And this was in the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. There hasn't been one other nuclear disaster that has claimed lives. And so we're looking at several thousand deaths from nuclear power station accidents in the history of humanity's use of nuclear power, which just seems pretty low. The fear that the public has seems to be linked to a sort of creepiness associated with nuclear power. It's sort of the silent killer radiation that will mutate my children. And those fears can be legitimate. You know, it's not something to be taken lightly, but safety measures are increasing all the time, as are ways to deal with the waste, new technologies. And again, as I said, it seems to be the only viable non-carbon option. Things like moral suasion seem to be hopeless. We often see this in public talks or in ethics, for philosophy ethics papers, this kind of everyone should do the right thing talk. You know, if only everyone would just do X, then we'll be fine. If everyone would just, you know, recycle their rubbish, or if only everyone would stop wasting. This again is just unrealistic. It doesn't take human nature into consideration. It's going to take regulation, or carbon taxes seem a possibility. Blaming big corporations is pointless as well. People like to point a figure at corporations, but corporations are just supplying the demand. They are giving you the things you need, like your refrigeration, your laptops, and your travel. And denying people these things while you are allowed to have them seems obviously hypocritical. And will anyone give up these things? Will you give up your refrigeration and your laptop in order to do the right thing? That just doesn't seem realistic. There's also a tragedy of the commons type problem that comes in here. As I mentioned, Luddism is unrealistic, and its adoption is usually, or at least those advocating for it, are usually, there's a hypocrisy to it, right? Exaggerating the risks to prompt action is unhelpful. So there's this idea that we should exaggerate the risks in order to wake people up. You know? So it's okay to exaggerate and paint a doomsday scenario, because it'll make people react. And as far as I can tell, this will be unhelpful. Well, first of all, it's lying and manipulative, and also if each person has their pet doomsday scenario and they're all exaggerate, which is happening now. People are being bombarded with these existential risks: AI, nuclear, climate, the collapse of capitalism, or the rise of capitalism. Trump's first term, now Trump's second term, you know, these are all like existential crises. Eventually people just kind of dull down. And if people think that things are hopeless, they tend to just give up. It's much better to give people a realistic vision of the future with a workable action plan for solving problems. So nuclear weapons, Gareth Evans, the founding governor of the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation Disarmament, has the following to say. He says, at risk of sounding complacent, and I'm not, I have to say that nuclear security too would benefit by being conducted a little less emotionally and a little more calmly and rationally than has tended to be the case. While the engineering know-how required to build a basic fission device like the Hiroshima or Nagasaki bomb is readily available, highly enriched uranium and weapons-grade plutonium are not as easily accessible. And to assemble and maintain for a long period out of sight of the huge intelligence and law enforcement resources that are now being devoted to this threat worldwide, the team of criminal operatives, scientists, and engineers necessary to acquire the components of, build, and deliver such a weapon would be a formidably difficult undertaking. So it seems very difficult to actually set off a nuclear weapon for a small group to do so. First of all, they need the motivation. Very few people are motivated to actually do that. I mean, we have Putin obeying all the laws of conventional warfare in the war on Ukraine, which is interesting. If he was such a maniac and such a tyrant, why would he be doing that? So there is just sort of, in general, people are sensible. There's a tendency to think of people as sheep and as a bunch of idiots who need to be guided and can't see the wood for the trees, and would, like lemmings, are just rushing towards the edge of a cliff. But in general, people are actually quite sensible. There's very few people who actually want to destroy the world or try to. And even then, they will find it very difficult to actually set off a nuclear weapon or any kind of weapon of mass destruction. Biological warfare, also very difficult to actually deploy. I think there's been one or two cases where just a handful of people were killed. And there's also the fact that no one has used nuclear weapons in anger since World War II. And so this should give us some optimism moving forward. Most nuclear powers are also slowly reducing their nuclear arsenals. The US and Russia have far more now than they had at the peak of the Cold War, and there are various agreements to continue reducing them. There's also some countries that have given up, like South Africa, have given up their nuclear ambitions. So things are moving in the right direction. There are more nuclear weapons being dismantled than there are being built on average at the moment, day to day. And even a worst case scenario, let's say USA and Russia launch all their missiles at each other, okay, worst case scenario. This would probably result in at most 1 billion deaths. So a few 100,000 from the initial blasts, perhaps into the millions, and then somewhere between 1 billion or just over 1 billion would die from a nuclear winter and famines that would result afterwards, which is obviously terrible. But is it an existential crisis? Is this an apocalyptic event? If 1/8 or 1/7 of humanity is killed, it's terrible, but it's not necessarily an existential threat. If existential means the end of humanity. So it's just, as I said before, we need to be careful of exaggerating just how severe these different threats are. Okay, so the most fashionable one at the moment is AI and the supposedly coming technological singularity. The worry is that an AGI, artificial general intelligence, will enslave us or wipe us out, either accidentally or when we try to shut it down. So psychologist Steven Pinker thinks there's 3 reasons to be skeptical about doomsday AI scenarios. He says these scenarios are based on a confusion of intelligence with motivation, of beliefs with desires, inferences with goals, computation with control. Even if an artificial intelligence system tried to exercise a will to power without the cooperation of humans, it would remain an impotent brain in a vat. So he's questioning whether increase in intelligence always comes with an increase in the desire to dominate and control and have power. There's no reason to think there is. It has happened that way in primates, but it's not necessarily the case. And it's not clear how an AGI would get its tentacles into everything and be able to destroy everyone. It would seem to need human cooperation to sort of move around and play its nasty tricks. Number 2, thinking of intelligence as a boundless continuum of potency, a miraculous elixir with the power to solve any problem, attain any goal. This is the second problem. Knowledge is acquired by formulating explanations and testing them against reality, not by running an algorithm faster and faster. So it's based on a basic misunderstanding of what intelligence is. Intelligence is kludgy. It's a sort of, in the brain, there are different networks, different modules dealing with different problems. Collectively, these form human intelligence. Just simply running an algorithm faster and faster won't necessarily get the same thing. Despite the progress in machine learning, particularly multi-layered artificial neural networks, currently AI systems are nowhere near achieving general intelligence, if that concept is even incoherent. Instead, they are restricted to problems that consist of mapping well-defined inputs to well-defined outputs. So even ChatGPT, large language models, they can do quite incredible things, but they're nowhere near making decisions for themselves, having a will, trying to infiltrate other systems. They're showing zero, malicious intent. They're way off anything like an actual AGI, if that's even possible. So I think the AI hype just needs to be toned down a bit. And as again, there's this link with ethics, where I would predict that if someone did a study, and this is just from my personal experience, I found that those working in AI ethics are far more inclined towards doomsday thinking than those working with AI technology, like engineers, programmers, and so on. So again, there's this relationship between ethics and doomsday thinking in the AI realm. And I'll get to why that is in the case. And again, as I said before, there's this if scenario. If Moore's law continues at the current rate, if humans do nothing about it, if AI can do this, if computer chips can be made smaller and smaller and smaller, if this, then oh my God, we're going to have AGI, and it can be able to do all these things. It's infinite, you know what I mean? So this if problem, it relies on many counterfactual steps, any one of which could not obtain. So this is some speculations on why I think this occurs. It's got something to do with a claim like this. The bigger the threat, the more seriously you must take my normative, specifically ethical claims. Ethics has no force if there isn't an impending cliff. I predict a correlation between the degree of moralizing behavior an individual exhibits and the degree of apocalyptic thinking they exhibit. So this is why you see apocalyptic thinking particularly prevalent amongst preachers, because preachers are moralists. They moralize to the congregation. They're giving an ethical message, and an ethical message has no force unless there's some kind of dire consequence that you don't listen. No one's going to listen to your ethical sermon if everything's going swimmingly and we're all just going to be fine. There must be some doomsday scenario, and the more drastic the doomsday scenario is, the more people are compelled to listen to your ethical message. And that would explain why doomsday thinking in AI is more prevalent among AI ethicists, because they want people to listen to the ethical theory. You must all do what I say you must do, otherwise there's this, Armageddon on its way. And so this correlation, I don't have any empirical studies, but it's a prediction I'm making that there will be, if someone did the empirical studies, there'd be a correlation between degree of moralizing behavior or concerns with ethics and degree of apocalyptic thinking. Let me just check on time. I might have to skip a few slides. Okay, well, quickly, another reason to be optimistic is that change tends to be gradual and trends tend to continue as they have in the past. This is not always the case, obviously, but in general, here's on the left is a graph of the last 30 years of the S&P 500. And so if you want to invest your money, any financial advisor will tell you that the safest bet is an ETF investing in the S&P 500 because of that trend. And unless you have some really profound evidence, some reason to think that the trend will move in a different direction, you should expect it to continue in its upward trajectory. And any financial advisor will tell you that. Obviously, there are ups and downs, but on average, the S&P 500 goes like this. And it should, all else being equal, without information to the contrary, out definitive, compelling information to the contrary, you can expect that it will continue to do this. The same with life expectancy. Here we see an upward trend as medical advances have, mostly due to medical advances. We should expect that it will keep going up. Now, there might be limits to how old we can get due to biological factors, but all things being equal, it does seem that this trend should continue. And just a few things to think about, how we all worried about the millennial bug, year 2000, right? So there's just a few doomsday scenarios that people took very seriously, but nothing happened. Millennial bug, 9/11, right? It was going to bring in all sorts of catastrophes. The 2007-2008 financial crisis, Brexit, COVID-19. I was very amazed with how well humanity dealt with COVID-19. All I ever hear is pessimism and criticism and finger pointing. But take a step back from them to think about how well we as a species dealt with COVID-19. Although there were problems, people came together, they cooperated, vaccines were spread, and we overcame the challenge as a global community. It's a very an incredible achievement. I never heard one person ever say it that way. It's always, this should have been done. They screwed up. They need to be held accountable. It should have been done this way. Russian invasion of Ukraine. As I mentioned, Russia have used no forbidden weapons. The Iranian bombing of Israel that happened recently. This graph here tanked when that happened, and then it went back up again because it turned out to be not much. Trump's first term, people were saying, what is Trump going to do if he's got his access to the red button to launch the nukes? He's going to bring the world to a standstill. Now people are saying, well, Trump, with a possible second term, he's going to do all the things that he planned to do but couldn't do in his first term. So again, the end of the world is nigh. If Trump comes to power, and the Microsoft bug that happened just a few days ago. Again, there was alarmism and doomsday thinking associated with that event, and nothing happened, right? Let me check time. Okay, let me skip this, I think. This is just to say that apocalypticism is both prevalent on the right and the left. The favorite doomsday prophecies on the right, Christian Armageddon, the second coming, the fall of capitalism and the implosion of the US, which then causes global chaos, nuclear destruction caused by Islamic extremists. So both on the left and the right, there is doomsday thinking. On the left, a capitalist march towards self-destruction, especially amongst Marxists, climate catastrophe, the AI technology singularity, and again nuclear destruction, as with the right, but this time caused by fascists rather than Islamic extremists. Something just worth mentioning briefly is the Messiah archetype. So with doomsday thinking come messiahs. Okay, it's almost like the two go hand in hand. And I've just drawn up, based on my own kind of reading about this phenomenon, which has always interested me, and I believe that there's a kind of almost a personality type, the Messiah archetype that comes along from time to time. And here's some of the characteristics. Middle-aged male, typically, okay, not always typically, a charismatic individual, a possible narcissist. I'm not, it's in brackets because I don't want to get too much into that. That's might be wrong. A sense of victimhood. The world is out to get me. I'm a sacrificial figure. Supposed prophetic ability. In other words, the ability to see into the future and predict Armageddon, which is the doomsday scenario. An ethical message. You must all listen to my message to avoid doomsday. Salvation if you do. And then also a tendency to gather a group of disciples around the Messiah or the Guru, and of instruction to those disciples that they try to recruit others, and a ultimate motivation of profit or power. Okay, so we have the most famous Messiah, Jesus, looked either like that or like that, depending on your fancy. Jim Jones, who we get the saying drank the Kool-Aid from. Charles Manson, who interestingly believed that there was an impending race war, a global race war between black and white coming. And he had his disciples on scramblers riding around the Arizona desert, trying to find a hole in the desert that leads to a cavern or in the center of the earth. So him and his followers would go and hide in the center of the earth while this global war raged. The black man would win the global war, according to Manson, but because black people don't know how to govern, he would then rise up out of the earth and take control, and him and his disciples would rule over humanity. That was his, and it fits all these different criteria here of a typical Messiah archetype. Here's L. Ron Hubbard, a very interesting character who founded Scientology. He's busy measuring the consciousness of a tomato here, which is bizarre. And now, in the 21st century, here is your new Messiah archetype. Okay, this is Sam Harris. There are many others. Middle-aged male, charismatic, very well-spoken, very articulate, and charming. I'm not sure about narcissism or victim. Well, he expresses victimhood. He's sort of, there's forces out there to get him. He has a prophetic ability. He sees an AI disaster coming in the future, which is the doomsday scenario. He has an ethical message. We should all engage in loving kindness meditation and take hallucinogenics, which is a very fashionable idea at the moment, and then everything will be okay. Then we will achieve salvation. He recruits disciples, which is now followers, Twitter followers, and then there will be a group of followers who are very close to the guru, who are the subscribers. They will get special access to the guru, maybe even win lunch with Sam Harris if you enter some competition. They are instructed to recruit more and more followers, and there's then payment of subscriptions and so on, which comes back to the Messiah, and power seeking within the public intellectual community. There, he's competing with people like Jordan Peterson for clicks, for FaceTime, and so on. So, how apocalyptic is the apocalypse? An apocalypse, okay, again, the center of apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic studies. An apocalypse does not mean the absolute end of all things, human or of nature. Rather, it is the beginning of a utopian or dystopian post-apocalyptic world that reconstitutes itself after the preceding doom. This notion of the apocalypse explains, but is not limited to the apocalypses and post-apocalypses derived from the Judeo-Christian tradition. Any ending of the world which implies more or less radical change in the conditions of living can be experienced as an apocalyptic revelation that shapes the future. So they like to think of the apocalypse not as an end of humanity, not as a cataclysmic extinction event, but almost as a sort of a bottleneck, a disaster, and out of that something new emerges, kind of a new dawn. So that's one way to think of the apocalypse, instead of absolute destruction. Historian Robert Volgas similarly says, in contrast to other notions of existential threat, for instance, existential crisis, catastrophe, cataclysm, rupture, apocalypse allows us to think about the end not as total destruction, but as a form of radical change of the paramount reality of a life world. The end of the world as we know it on different scales, from global to individual, followed by a predominantly dystopian post-apocalypse, but also as the founding event, in the sense given by the term Alain Badiou, of a potentially better world. So this is a sort of and I guess the Christian apocalypse is like this. There will be a sort of global floods and disasters, but then a new small group emerges out of this, and a new dawn, the new kingdom begins after that. So given what I've said, I think we can distinguish between the following: three different types of apocalypse, or cataclysm, or whatever. A, apocalypse in a relatively mild sense, local disasters. Something might be apocalyptic for a city or a community, but this is not apocalyptic on a global scale. Then B, apocalypse in the sense of a global catastrophe that ushers in a new era. This is what I spoke about in the previous slide. And apocalypse, capital letters, in the sense of an extinction event or end of days scenario. So we just need to be careful when we talk about existential crises, apocalypse, doomsday. What exactly do we mean? It could be one of these three things. As far as I can tell, apocalypse type A seems quite likely when it comes to climate change, AI, and nuclear disasters. In other words, there will be local events, and hopefully we'll learn from them. Apocalypse type B seems unlikely when it comes to AI, but slightly more likely when it comes to climate change and nuclear disasters. Apocalypse type C seems very unlikely when it comes to climate change and AI, but slightly more likely when it comes to nuclear disaster. So there is a possible of a nuclear destruction. And the same applies to the other terms which are closely linked. I've just used apocalypse as a typical term. But in fact, the most likely way for apocalypse, capital letters, to occur is that a large asteroid collides with Earth. But nobody worries about this because it has no ethical repercussions. There's nothing, no one can come along and say, if we all, I mean, there are people who do this, but you'd sound like a kook if you said, we must all behave in this ethically way to avoid the asteroid impact. So it's not taken that seriously because it doesn't have this ethical component that is so central to do other forms of doomsday thinking. Here's an artist's, what do they call them, reproduction of the impact that is believed to have caused the extinction of dinosaurs. That's the sort of size it was, of the Gulf of Mexico. And here's the size of that asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs next to Manhattan. So this is pretty big. And something slightly bigger could have even more devastation. But we don't need to worry too much because we have Bruce Willis and Ben Affleck and his crew who can save us in case an asteroid is coming. And again, it's interesting that I can make that joke because there are no ethical repercussions. I couldn't really make that joke if about climate change or nuclear war. People listening to this talk might be offended if I did, but I can make, because of the ethical repercussions. So because there's no ethical repercussions here, I can make that kind of joke. People in general don't like you joking about things that they think are ethically important. Thank you very much. The end.
Thank you very much, Ragnar. Wow. This is a lot to digest. And I see you've put up references there for anybody that's interested as well to look into some of your sources. Thank you so much for a provocative talk. You've made me think quite a lot, and I noticed that a few of the things that you said made me jerk a little bit, which gives me some indication of my own biases that I may have. I want to just ask that everybody can, if you maybe stop sharing your screen, and then I'll be able to see all the participants and see if anybody, thank you so much. So if anybody would like to make a comment or ask a question, then raise your hands and we'll go through. We still have plenty of time. We still have 15 minutes or so. But maybe in the meantime, I could just possibly say my initial thoughts, Ragnar, just to give everybody else a chance to catch their breath. There's so much about what you say that rings true to me, and yet I'm very concerned about the kind of conflation of crises with apocalyptic sort of thinking, because I think there is apocalyptic thinking happening. And I've been guilty of it. When I moved here in 2012, I was absolutely certain the world was going to implode into economically. I was absolutely sure that all of these terrible things were going to happen very, very soon. And I began living a life in response to those apocalyptic style ideas. And now, 12 years later, and I'm only talking from a personal perspective, of course, none of the things that I was afraid of have happened. So there's so much about what you say that connects. And I also think that disaster capitalism is a big thing. There's a commodification of fear, and it's a commercialization, if you like, of crises. I think that's really important to acknowledge. The one thing I would say, though, in response to your talk, is that for me, existential crisis is about the crisis of existence as we know it, not necessarily the end of that existence. And my personal response to crisis is not about a future that I don't want to see. It's about a present that I'm not comfortable with. It's about the levels of anxiety and depression. It's about the disappearance of the diversity in my area. It's about the rampant inequality all around me. So my personal response to crisis is about what I see and experience in my own locale, not necessarily these ideas about the future. But yeah, lots to think on. I'm gonna probably comment again if I get a chance, but for now, I can see we've got some hands up. Okay, I believe, Gary, according to this, the order is shown. So Gary, I think you're first, if we can hear from you, and then after that, we'll pop over to Chris.
Yeah, I mean, we can maybe let Chris go first, given that I'm sort of part of the team, but we'll give other voices a chance first, if you're happy, Emma.
Okay, sure. Yeah, Chris, if you're willing to go, we'll take your comment.
Okay, thanks. Hey, thanks for a great talk. It was you had a lot of points, and I'm just trying to consider what the main issue was. A side issue seems to have been about ethics, claims about problems with the ethics as a sort of philosophical approach or field. But just what I thought I might mention. Actually, it's funny that the characteristics of a Messiah archetype strangely match much of Trump's discourse, but that's just an aside. You did say nobody worries about the asteroid. I think actually people do, but maybe not the same as things we could do something about. Although, as far as I know, there are people watching all the time for asteroids, and if you can catch it early enough, you can send out a missile that just knocks it slightly off course far away, then it's unlikely to hit Earth. So there are actually people trying to make sure that that doesn't happen. But it seems the reason we don't worry as much about that as other things we do have more agency over is precisely because, you can't worry about what you can't change. Well, you can, but it's better to worry about things you can change. So it's a question of agency. What comes on our radar and consciousness is related to our agency and what we can do something about. And that might feed into another thing that you mentioned, which is perhaps more substantive to your talk, which was the claim that ethics has no force without an impending cliff. And you gave the analogy of a fire and brimstone preacher. But that's like just one kind of preacher, and it's one kind of ethicist. There's many ways of engaging in ethical encouragement to people, and not all of it involves apocalyptic thinking. So maybe that claim could be, I don't know, less, more, perhaps refined. Just to say that there's some ethics that relies on an impending cliff, but not all. And then you said that the degree of moralism would correlate with the degree of apocalyptic thinking. And again, I would perhaps challenge that claim. It seems a bit isolated and doesn't consider the full range of ethical, normative thought in philosophy. Yeah, I think I'm going to leave it at that. These are just some considerations that you might think about, which I respond to your talk. Thanks very much, Ragnar.
Okay, sure, thanks. Yeah, yeah, that's a good point, that there is some ethics that is perhaps more interested in self-improvement, perhaps wouldn't emphasize apocalypse or crises as much. But in general, what I find is that there is a correlation. And if there are ethicists, I'm sure that there are, then I'm not talking about those ones. But I've noticed this trend that when people are engaging in moralizing behavior, whether it's writing an ethics paper or standing on a stage in a public square with a microphone, there's a tendency to exaggerate some threat in order to get the message across. As you said, that's not always going to be the case. So maybe I'm just warning against that and just sort of bringing it to your attention and encouraging us to be wary of falling into that type of discourse. As far as the correlation between a concern with moralizing and a concern with doomsday thinking, it's just a prediction. It's an empirical prediction. I could be wrong, but I suspect that there's going to be some sort of correlation there. One's ethical message has so much more force. People are so much more obliged to take it seriously if you have some drastic consequence to not doing so. If everything is great, if everything is fine, people have little incentive to take your moral message seriously. But that's an empirical claim, and maybe one day, if someone does the study, or if I've come across someone who has done the study, we can take a bet and then see who wins.
Okay, thanks very much, Ragnar, for your response. Okay, we've got Helen and we still have Gary. So, yeah. Gary, do you want to go, or do you want to wait to the end?
Let me jump in quickly, and I'll try and be
great.
brief. Ragnar, thanks very much for that. So if I understand the thrust of your argument is it's effectively that the exaggeration of a threat to gain attention is the thing that you're cautioning about. So just as a bit of background, I lead a project that is focused on building resilience against climate change for the city, and have been an anti-nuclear activist in terms of the Tasman power plant specifically. So in terms of, so the difficulty for me is that we have factual evidence of certain things. So we have factual evidence of 5 extinction events across the world that were primarily, the majority of those were climate related. One of them was an asteroid, but the rest are not external objects, but they were climate in terms of how the Earth is situated to the sun and how it moved and that kind of stuff. So that created mass die-off of species, and we have that on record. I mean, it's archaeological argument. You know, so the big debate in science at the moment is whether this is a 6th extinction level event that we're going through at the moment, because we anticipate over 1 million species dying off by the end. By 2050, around about there. That's the one debate, and the other debate is whether this is the era of the Anthropocene. So in terms of humans impacting the world around them. But we know for a fact that the Earth is tracking. So if you look at the IPCC stuff, and I noticed in your stuff you haven't referred to the IPCC. I don't know if you know who the IPCC is, but that's your global community of scientists that do assessments of climate change and that kind of stuff. And when they don't predict, what they do is they do scenarios based on certain things. So the if component of your argument, I understand the if thing, but it diminishes the actual the science, that we actually have science that can tell us that we have been trending in a certain direction, and unless we do certain things, we will continue that trend. So the trend currently, so today is, I think yesterday and today have been the hottest days in recorded history. Now recorded history means that it's the hottest that humans have ever experienced, but not the hottest that the planet has experienced. And so with Emma, I agree that the existential component is not the wiping out of humanity, but the significant alteration of living conditions and numbers of people, etc. So a significant difference, put it that way. But we are heading towards 4 degrees by the end of the century, and 4 degrees brings a very different environment to us. Now we know that because of the physics of it. It's not a guess in that sense. We know the physics of how fresh water into salt water, what that does, the melting of the icebergs and that kind of stuff. What we don't know is what the cumulative impact of one thing happening. So AMOC, for instance, which is the circular movement of currents in the North Atlantic, if that stops, the whole climate changes for Britain, and the indications are that it is stopping. So the question to you, for me, the Pinker and other guys that use the arguments, they amplify what is effectively fringe arguments in the science at this point in time. And I'm not sure that that's constructive. The more constructive thing for me is that we are trending towards a certain different scenario for humanity, and how best do we prepare for that? Now that's not a doomsday thing, and you don't need. And so in the sectors that I've worked, we've been very careful not to be doomsday and not to use doomsday as the leverage to get people to act. But you have to have people act. We have to stop using fossil fuel unless we want to go, and that we know is a fact because of the CO2 emissions is linked to fossil fuel use. So the question to you, Ragnar, would be is if the science is very clear that we are trending to a certain in a certain direction, and we have consistently, we're not changing that pattern, how best then do we engage with humanity to alert humanity of that and the need for action in response to that?
Yeah, okay, so I'm not necessarily a policy. I mean, I'm not a policy expert. So your final question is a bit difficult for me to answer. I mean, I could speculate on what I think might be, ways to encourage people, but I'm not 100% sure what would work. I'm a bit pessimistic whether anything will work, and it might be a case that we will just keep moving in the same direction, and there will be these kind of local disasters that I'm talking about, and humanity will have to adapt. So my concern is not to deny that there are trends, and I'm not saying I'm not a climate change denier. The trends you're talking about exist, I'm sure, of course. The question I'm challenging here is whether that leads to an apocalypse or a end of days scenario. Specifically for humans. So when you said that there've been animal extinctions, that's obviously unfortunate, but those are not existential events. I'm talking about human, so to say that there's an existential crisis is to say, I mean, the word existence, it means a threat to our existence. An existential crisis is a crisis that threatens human existence. So I'm questioning that. When one uses terms like existential crisis or apocalypse or global cataclysm, I'm just questioning whether those terms accurately are the outcome of the things you're talking about. I'm not questioning the trends or that there have been extinction events, but do these constitute the kind of scenarios that I've painted? Obviously, something needs to be done. It's not good that species are being destroyed. It's not good that cities might be flooded or that there might be, these temperature changes and famines that result. But I'm questioning whether that will lead to an end of days scenario where human beings go extinct.
Oh, you're muted, Gary. Oh.
Yeah. So Ragnar, I mean, the point is that both within the nuclear industry debate and the climate change debate is that no one is arguing the wiping out of, well, it's a fringe argument in terms of the wiping out of humanity. What the mainstream argument is that, particularly in terms of climate change, is that it will cause significant change and disruption to the current lifestyle of the majority of peoples on the planet. So a 4-degree increase in temperature would make the tropical zone unlivable in effect in terms of the, now that's not a doomsday scenario. That's an accurate prediction based on what plants can manage in that. I mean, so you have, so IPCC uses something like 15,000 scientific papers to come to the scenarios that they predict. For me, so there is so I'm with you in terms of the doomsday, but I would differentiate between an existential crisis and a doomsday scenario. So no one in the mainstream is arguing doomsday, but there is a significant argument about existential crisis in the sense that it doesn't threaten humanity's existence in entirety, but its existence significantly. And at a significant rate for us to pay attention to that, so the culmination, the end point of your argument would be is that we continue using fossil fuels in our vehicles. I mean, would you, so that's the so if we just keep on doing things that we are doing, it, to me, would seem irrational if we know that those actions have a consequence.
Now, jump in quick, gentlemen, and just remind everyone it's 5 minutes past the end time. So we're just going to have to, unfortunately, keep things little bit tight. We still need to hear from Helen, so I'm sorry to be rude and disrupt the conversation. Would you be okay with that, Ragnar, if we hear from Helen quickly? Sorry, Gary.
No problem.
Sure. Helen, are you there? Thanks.
Yeah, I am. Thanks, gents. Yeah, I mean the business of the doomsday and things being overstated and whatever, yes, that probably can't be said too often. I think it's interesting, the notion of like the ethical and political stuff around that. I'm not going to gibber on. I am going to say the quote, the 1960 quote from the physicist who said, if there is not more serious and sober thought, we're going to be in apocalypse. And after 1960, more serious and sober thought did come to bear on the nuclear arms race. So more serious and sober thought, yay, what we're on to. And that the apocalypse stuff has so much sort of perverse incentives to it and is so counterproductive that kind of needs a little investigation, I would think. And just mostly what I notice and what keeps coming up, and I noticed you were struggling with it as well, to say, if I don't say it's apocalypse, I have to say it's okay for all of these local disasters, as you know, and hopefully the location is going to be over there somewhere. So I think the ethical, spiritual, human challenge of this is to hold both things at once, that it may not be existential for apocalyptic for all life on Earth. And even if it is, it'll, you know, probably come back in 20 million or so years. To hold that, and at the same time hold every child who dies, every personal catastrophe is somebody that somebody loves, and those things, each one, how to hold that at the same time. And it's not either or, and it's just really difficult to do both, but I think that's what the situation calls for. And Gary, if you want to be a messiah, I'll sign up. Okay, that's me. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, just a quick response maybe to both Gary and Helen is yeah, I'm not denying the trends, as I said at the beginning of the talk, or denying that something needs to be done. I guess just the modest version of my central point is that we should just be more cautious about using terms like existential crisis, global catastrophe. What exactly counts as something like that? Is the extinction of some animal species a global catastrophe? Maybe to ecologists it is, but I'm a little bit worried about exaggeration there. And the same with existential crisis. If you know, if there's widespread famine killing hundreds of millions, that's obviously bad. But is it an existential crisis? These terms are these very explosive, bold terms are used in order to make a point, and it comes across as a kind of an exaggeration. We don't need this sort of doomsday thinking using these strong emotive terms when it's not actually accurate that such extreme consequences will follow from these different risks. It's not to deny the risks, just to kind of urge a toning down how we speak about the consequences of these things.
Okay, thanks again, Ragnar. There's one last final before we go. I know we're 10 minutes over, but just in the chat box to make sure everybody is heard, I see Vanessa's posted. And I want to give you a chance to respond quickly, Ragnar. She says, thank you for an excellent talk. If there's time, I'd be grateful if you could comment on the commodification of fear that Emma mentioned and the idea that capitalism lives off the constant reproduction of apocalypse. So that's Vanessa's comment. So if we could just finish off with your response to that, Ragnar, for today.
Okay, I'm not quite sure what capitalism living off the concept of production of apocalypse means. And
Well,
what the commodification. These are sort of phrases that I'm not quite sure what they mean.
okay. Well, I guess those are more phrases that I used rather than phrases that you used. And I was just referring to disaster capitalism, i.e. the idea that, you know, all sorts of crises, wherever there's a problem, there's a solution to be bought. So often we have a conflation of fact and sort of truth and partial truth in order to suit certain agendas. I think that's what I was referring to, but let me not take any more of our time. I'd like to thank you, Ragnar, for your time and for a provocative talk. You've made me think, and I really appreciate your input. I'm sure everybody here does as well. I think we will have to leave it at that for today, and I would really hope to see everybody next week when we shall be hearing from Alex. So goodbye for now, everyone.